Hello and welcome to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week here on Monocle Radio. This week, we have a special coverage of the U.S. elections, and we hear from Dana Perino, former White House press secretary.
He has his finger on the pulse of what his voters want. He is his own person. He is just somebody who will go 100% in your face, and that is not my style at all. And it's not the style of the guy that I work for, George W. Bush, but things change.
Plus, the delights of Hokkaido cuisine.
Very unique food culture, even in a country where there's unique food culture everywhere. And I learned about the indigenous Ainu food and, of course, the seafood as well, which is sort of the best in Japan, I would say, maybe.
All that and much more in the next hour, here on The Curator, with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. And this week, the Monocle Radio team camped up in Washington, D.C. to cover the U.S. elections, so expect plenty of content about it on this week's Curator. Whatever you may think of Donald Trump, it's clear that he has upended the traditional style of campaign and communication. So we decided to speak with Dana Perino, former White House press secretary, host of Perino on Politics, and co-host of the cable news most watched show, The Five on Fox.
I was just telling a friend that it was such a great experience to be with the team at Fox News because the main sort of group of us have been doing this together for 3 cycles now. So we did 2016, 2020, and 2024. So one, we're good friends. We have camaraderie and we have a common history. So I think that our energy and ability to play off of each other and to have that great respect of like, that's a good point, or you know what, I better pay attention to when Brit Hume is talking because I want to hear what he has to say about that. So to see if I could come up with something. And I thought that was great. The whole package was good. I think the best news for our country is that this was a decisive result. There are no questions about election integrity. And after going through the last 4 years of what we've all been through, I think that is a really important thing for all of us to have. It doesn't mean there weren't some problems and some states couldn't do a better job, but overall, the integrity of the vote is secured.
Well, and on that point, Dana, Biden earlier today spoke quite passionately about this idea of the transfer of power. And of course, Trump had not necessarily said that he would accept the result. But were you surprised after all those threats of violence and all the myriad of confusion about election interference? Were you at all surprised that it went as smoothly as it did?
In a way, except that I am reminded that, first of all, a lot of that was bluster from both sides and preparing for what could be a very close election. And, right up until the votes were counted, it was tied. I remember waking up on election morning and getting the results from Ditchville, Knox, New Hampshire. That's the first town in America that votes every cycle. There's a very small population, 6 people. And the result was 3 for Trump and 3 for Harris. And I thought, of course it was, because this election has been so close all along. And I would say this, though, many states, I would say, except for Pennsylvania, really tightened up their counting. Well, let me say Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada. I think those 3 states could probably use their state legislatures' time well in the next 4 years to try to improve upon their processes. For example, in Nevada, they have a lot of early voting and a lot of mail voting, but they don't do any of the election sort of tabulation until all the polls are closed. No, not even the polls are closed. So everybody that's in line has finished voting. I think that could be tightened up. We are in the modern technological age. There's no reason that they couldn't count votes like Florida does or Georgia does. There are some really good best practices out there. And there's some state legislatures that should take a look at that. But I think also, even though it's frustrating for somebody from the outside looking in, in fact, I talked to a woman today. She's a green card holder from Ukraine. And she was very confused as to why all these different states count differently. And as I tried to explain it to her, I understand that it's a little bit confusing. However, it does make sure that there's not widespread corruption, right? Because if you were going to have some big corruption scheme, you'd have to do it in all 50 states. And that's very hard to do, which is why I think this time around, with it being more decisive, we have the integrity of the vote intact. And that means a lot in terms of just, okay, let's move on then. What's the transition? And then the Democratic Party can think about what happens to them going forward, because they lost so decisively.
Dana, I was at one of Donald Trump's last rallies, the one in Lititz, Pennsylvania, on Sunday. And I did want to ask you, as a former press secretary as well, what did you make of Donald Trump's style of communication in those final days? Would you have been kind of pulling your hair out in those final days when he goes off script? Or is that something that we actually have learned through this, that you actually have to either encourage, or at least it just works for him, whatever else we say?
Yeah, I think that you have to respect that he has his finger on the pulse of what his voters want. He is his own person. He has a lot of energy. He is unapologetic. He is brash. He is just somebody who will go 100% in your face. And that is not my style at all. And it's not the style of the guy that I work for, George W. Bush. But things change. And the electorate was changed by Obama. He was a very different type of campaigner. I don't think he ever made somebody like me want to faint with things that he was saying. But I remember in Obama's reelect, there was a whole piece about how Obama wasn't having fun on the trail, and that one of the pieces of advice from the campaign advisors was, you have to let Obama be Obama. Stop trying to script him so much. Let him be himself. And perhaps also because there's so many different ways for people to look at the candidates now, and voters want authenticity in everything that they're consuming and everything that they're buying. They want authenticity, and that includes their candidates. And I do think Kamala Harris had a real problem with that, because she campaigned so cautiously and very tentatively that it made voters think she was just not being straight with them.
And Dana, just, looking back, you were, of course, press secretary in the Bush administration during quite a similar wartime. And Trump is coming into office when there's a myriad of conflicts around the world. I'm curious from your take, what advice would you have for whoever ends up being his new press secretary?
Well, one of the things is that there is no substitute for knowing the policy and knowing your president and knowing the commander-in-chief. And I'm sure that President Trump will be this way as he was before, which is he allows the press secretary to be in the room when decisions are being discussed and made, so that even if it's classified, because you would have a classified clearance, that doesn't mean you're going to go to the White House podium and tell everybody what just happened. But it does mean that, one, the reporters know that you are in the know. And that matters. It also matters for them to understand that in any given time, there are many different audiences watching the United States, the commander-in-chief, and the White House at any time. And that would be, of course, the general public in America, our military, our allies, our adversaries, and I can't remember the fifth one off the top of my head. I feel like Rick Perry in that debate in 2016. But there's multiple audiences watching all at once. And you have to make sure that you are communicating very, very clearly about what the president's intentions are. However, I would say this. I don't know if the press secretary has a lot to do, because President Trump likes to talk to the media. He communicates well through them, and he utilizes social media to do that. So I think that you're going to have direct communication from the president of the United States, which in some ways makes the press secretary's job harder, but in other ways makes it much easier. So you're going to have to decide. But I think it'll be a good job for whoever gets it.
And we stay in the U.S. Donald Trump's re-election to the U.S. presidency after losing it is not entirely unprecedented. Grover Cleveland, who may never again be a pub quiz answer, did it in 1892. What is new is the president-elect not only awaiting sentencing after being convicted in a court of law, but facing several further indictments, in Trump's specific case on charges of attempting to overturn the 2020 presidential election and stealing classified documents as he left the White House. To tell us more, we were joined by Melissa Hamilton, professor of law and criminal justice at the University of Surrey.
The judge in that case had already been reconsidering the conviction itself because of a recent Supreme Court ruling granting a president greater immunity than we previously thought. And that could have impacted the evidence that was admitted in the case. So the judge could actually toss the conviction on that ground. But even if the judge does not, he could postpone the sentencing, which this judge has been shown he's amenable to doing because he has delayed sentencing a few times already. And then the other alternative is, yes, he could go ahead and go through with the sentencing on November 26th.
I mean, if he did do that, and I do realize that this is probably not the likeliest outcome, but is sending the president-elect to prison still technically an option?
Yes. So this is the state court and the judge could send him to prison. But likely the federal government then would argue on the grounds of the Supremacy Clause, which indicates that states can't impede the operation of the federal government. So the contention, I imagine, would be that imprisoning a president in a state court would impede the president's ability to do the job of the president of the United States. So they could request that the state release the president on that ground, or if the state would not, they could go to court and ask for an order of release.
Well, let's look at some of the other charges pending, those ones relating to the 2020 presidential election. These are the ones being brought by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith. Do we assume that that's all now done?
Yes, most everybody assumes so. So it's a president could remove Jack Smith entirely, alternative, or in addition, order the Justice Department to drop charges. And then there's also the possibility of a self-pardon, although the legality of that is still somewhat subject to some question.
I mean, Donald Trump is not president yet, and he won't be until January 20th. Is it likely, though, that the current administration would just take the view that, proceeding full steam ahead with this would just be, even if it is logistically possible, politically completely unviable? Yes.
We have certainly seen in the last 6 years or so, probably even longer, that justice and the law is not immune from some political considerations. So I think there are some practicalities that the officials will be considering here and not just the legalities and potential criminal wrongdoing.
Is Trump also able to make those outstanding charges in Georgia go away? Because as I understand it, like the ones in New York, these are state charges, not federal charges.
Yeah, so that is significantly different because Georgia as a state is a separate sovereign, meaning that they have their own independent right to prosecute. So it's not nearly as simple as the federal charges. However, there could also be an argument under the Supremacy Clause again, to the extent I imagine an argument saying requiring a president to engage in their own defense in a criminal case could be interfering with the presidential duties.
I mean, as we were discussing in the first item in this show, there was that recent Supreme Court ruling which does give the President of the United States extraordinary immunity from prosecution. Does that protect Trump in the event of serious criminal behavior on his part being, this is as in past criminal behavior, being exposed while he's serving?
Well, the immunity then will shelter more of his potential behavior than we thought before. Investigations could still occur, but it's even though the immunity ruling is broad, it doesn't cover everything a president does while in office. It only is covering their official duties. So it is possible that charges can be brought, but I imagine they will not be brought during the presidency if they're a prosecutor thought there was sufficient evidence of criminal behavior during the presidency. They would probably wait until after the president left office and to bring prosecution at that point.
And just finally, and I guess it's a question proceeding in the opposite direction. Once Trump is sworn in on January 20th, and he has talked about this before, this idea of pardoning those people who were imprisoned for their roles in the insurrection of January 6th, 2021. Is that as straightforward as it looks? Can he just sign a piece of paper and release all of them?
Yes, the presidential pardon power is quite broad. The only real limitation is that it would only be for federal convictions. So if to the extent that any January 6th rioter was also charged with some state crime, the pardon would not cover that state crime. So there's actually no limitation, even though this situation is significantly different than other pardons, because here the president has some personal connection to it, but that's not a legal reason to preclude the president from making those pardons.
We're back with the curator, and we are staying in the US. In this election campaign, more than any other, American voters have been subject to a merciless onslaught of broadcast advertising, which most of the democratic world would regard as somewhere between strange and inexplicable. And, as Monocle's Andrew Miller discovers, not without reason.
Listeners in non-American jurisdictions may well feel by now that they have heard more than enough about the 2024 US presidential election. That for months now, it has scarcely been possible to switch on a television, tune in a radio, open a laptop, or glance into a phone without being berated by hyperventilating coverage of the contest. As listeners in the United States would doubtless be happy to confirm, it could be a lot worse. At least those weary, fearful foreigners are not being subjected to this.
Kamala was in on it. She covered up Joe's obvious mental decline.
Our president is in good shape, in good health, tireless, vibrant, and I have no doubt about the strength of the work that we have done.
But Kamala knew Joe couldn't do the job, so she did it. Look what she got done. A border invasion, runaway inflation, the American dream dead.
Or this.
Here's a 78-year-old billionaire who has not stopped whining about his problems.
Oh, she had a big crowd. Oh, the crowd.
This weird obsession with crowd sizes. It just goes on.
Or this.
I do remember the day that he suggested that we shoot people on the streets.
A second term would be worse. There will be no one to stop his worst instincts. Unchecked power, no guardrails. If we elect Trump again, we're in terrible danger.
The United States is not alone in permitting political advertising to be broadcast during campaigns, but it is distinctive in fostering such a lurid and rambunctious culture of radio and TV campaign ads. Reviewing the 2024 slate, an astonishing onslaught of apocalyptic hyperbole.
Under Harris, over 10 million illegally here. 250,000 Americans dead from fentanyl. Brutal migrant crimes, and ISIS now here.
Do you have any plans to visit the border? You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. I mean, I don't understand the point that you're making.
Kamala Harris, failed, weak, dangerously liberal.
Who will Trump look out for in his second term?
I think I could have a very good relationship with President Putin. I'm not disavowing that he called me a genius.
It's not you.
One can easily end up wondering whether they reflect America's present demented polarization or have done something to cause it. Except that the attack ad is nothing new in American politics. The first may have been this 1952 spot aired on behalf of Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson, governor of Illinois, featuring a two-headed and two-faced Republican sideshow attraction.
Any more questions? What about aid to Europe? I'll personally tear down the Iron Curtain. Not another nickel down that rat hole. Let the commies have it. That's double talk. What are you complaining about? You get two policies for the price of one.
Which might have played better for Stevenson had his Republican opponent not been General Dwight Eisenhower, architect of D-Day and liberator of Europe, who duly won 39 states. Others have been more effective. In 1964, incumbent Democrat President Lyndon Johnson was challenged by irascible Republican Barry Goldwater. Johnson's campaign aired an ad of a little girl plucking petals off a flower until brutally interrupted.
6, 8, 9, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
It was pulled after one showing amid considerable uproar, but was widely held to have terrified a goodly number of voters towards Johnson, who won 44 states. Since then, the attack ad has been a key, if controversial, part of American presidential campaigns, even those now regarded through rose-tinted glasses as paragons of bipartisan good sportsmanship.
Ronald Reagan is not a man that I would want leading our country for any period of time.
Ronald Reagan is not a leader.
I think he would have gotten us into a war right by this time. Carter certainly hasn't.
Bill Clinton's health plan puts the government in control, and that will ration health care and limit a doctor's ability to save your life.
The future stands before us. We must choose which kind it will be. A future with killer weapons orbiting above us, or the promise of a better future. It's not too late if we act now.
And though the rhetoric has escalated, the parameters are essentially the same. A vote for our opponent is a vote to reduce your neighbourhood to an irradiated hellscape in which the living envy the dead. A vote for us is a vote for a big sack of cash to be left on your doormat every other Wednesday and beer to come out of the taps. Inane and or annoying though many of these ads may seem or indeed be, political advertising is huge business in the US. Estimates of the total ad spend in the 2024 election run well north of $10 billion, a figure believed significantly up on what was spent in 2020, which itself shattered records in this respect. A reasonable question is thus raised. Does any of it make the slightest amount of difference? Has an attack ad, has any political ad, ever shifted a single vote? An old joke in advertising circles tells of the business which is sure half their ad budget is wasted, they just don't know which half. Hilariously, most research into the effectiveness of political ads has returned a similarly nonplussed conclusion. A recent study by Boffins at the American Political Science Review yielded the revelation that, broadly, nobody really knows what works or why. That being the case, there is little that the mercilessly bombarded viewer or listener can do other than try to enjoy it, and some of the 2024 vintage have verged on the amusing. This one, from the campaign of Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of the California 14th, featured a fake Donald Trump, but real Donald Trump quotes.
Then a friend told us there was somewhere he could get the help he so desperately needed, called A Place for Trump.
Person, woman, man, camera, TV.
Now he has round-the-clock support and can enjoy the things he loves, like eating cheeseburgers and rage posting at 3 a.m.
I know windmills very much, and they're driving the whales, I think, a little batty.
And this, from the campaign of Vice President Kamala Harris, took pointed issue with certain of former President Donald Trump's remarks about the biggest city in the key swing state of Pennsylvania.
Philly Tough is different. They insult us.
Bad things happen in Philadelphia. Bad things.
They don't like us. We don't care. Because here's the thing that people like Donald Trump don't understand. We're Philly. F***ing Philly. And when you fight us, we fight back.
In the interests of balance, we should here include a pro-Trump ad which is smart, witty and knowing, and not in the slightest certifiably bananas. Well, we looked.
Think Kamala Harris is bad. Meet Tim Walz, the Manchurian candidate. Walz got married on the Tiananmen Square anniversary and visited China 30 times, including his honeymoon.
As for what might be done about this plague of partisan scaremongering, while one hesitates for obvious reasons to advance modern British politics as a model anybody else should emulate, the UK has at least definitively dealt with the corrosive threat posed by hysterical political advertising on radio and television. There isn't any. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
And I told you, we did cover the US elections from all angles, including the role of typeface in campaigns, which tropes have been embraced in the visual identities in this year's race, and why might some of those design decisions look a little familiar. To find out, Monocle's Maylee Evans spoke with Charles Nix, designer, typographer, and senior executive creative director at Monotype.
We have a selective typographic baggage, especially in the United States around campaigns, that grows out of what was available in type when television was introduced. When visual media became a thing, we had a lot of very large sans serif wood type. That was the largest type available because it was physical type that needed to be printed. And so you end up with a lot of expectation around political posters and signage and campaigns, hearkening back to this initial idea. Now we have access to digital font files that we can set as large or as small as we want, but we still fall back on this sort of idea of an authentic campaign consisting of really large sans serif typography. This year's election, I think they fit very much into the mode that we've come to expect over the last 100 years, maybe even longer in typography for campaigns. Lots of all caps, lots of sans serif, and everything as large as possible. The sort of simplicity of that cuts through. We know when we type emails to one another that if we type in all caps, that we're shouting. This is the mode for political campaigns. It's all caps all the time. If we took the typographic lessons we know from other parts of our lives and applied it to this, it's that simplicity of a very loud voice in a very simple type. That's what's at the core of it. That's the thing that you know will march through all of the different iterations, maintain itself. What happens around the periphery of it, the sort of remixing, the different color schemes that get applied, the different places it shows up on hats and t-shirts and on tote bags, all of that is besides the big, giant, immediate simplicity of it. When one thinks about the typography of campaigns, it's the connection of the typography to the individual who's running. If there seems to be an authentic connection, for instance, if we take the previous Trump campaign where he was simply using Arial bold, it was very authentic to this devil-may-care kind of attitude of the campaign.
We're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world.
It was sort of breaking down traditional notions. And so using something really unexpectedly under-designed was very much in keeping with the nature of the campaign. The typeface Gotham is almost synonymous with the first 2 decades of the 21st century. It came along at a time when all of us were becoming aware of our lives becoming increasingly digital. And it's so associated with that period of our sort of human evolution. When it was adopted by the Obama campaign, it became supercharged. It was a sort of embodiment typographically of the optimism that we all felt about this century, but also the candidate of Barack Obama. And so it was a perfect marriage typographically for the time and for the candidate. This year, the Trump campaign has adopted Gotham, or something at least very Gotham-esque, moving more towards a formula that worked 20 years ago, the cleaned up version of their previous incarnation, which in a way is inauthentic, but at the same time, it's a design trope. They're leaning on something that makes them look a little more put together, but ironically, it's the same typeface that Barack Obama used so many years ago.
This is so consistent about Donald Trump. He puts himself before the needs of others. I fear that he really lacks empathy.
What's most interesting about the Harris-Waltz typographic aspect is that this has come together as a campaign at really breakneck speed. Like normally there would be plenty of sort of focus group testing and plenty of options available, but this had to be created really quick. It's not just any type that they've chosen. They've chosen a very condensed sans serif type, very much in the sort of Franklin Gothic extra condensed model that we see in posters for like Chisholm in 1972.
What's wrong with my running for president of this country? After all, for 15 years, I have been the ghostwriter for a lot of them.
It's unadorned, it's large, does what it needs to, which is speak with immediacy, a sense of urgency about how this campaign came together so quickly. What I find most interesting of late is how much more present variations on that typography are than the actual typography that they chose. And so we're starting to see people sort of picking up the idea, but making their own versions of it.
You will have the chance to make a decision that directly impacts your life, the life of your family, and the future of this country we love.
There are a whole series of Harris-Waltz campaign posters that look like the Trump posters from the previous election. The reason for that is troubling and amazing at the same time. And I know that there are places in this country where hanging out a Harris-Waltz sign could get you in a lot of trouble with your neighbors who are Trump supporters. And so adopting the character of the Trump campaign in order to say the words of Harris-Waltz is, it's an interesting thing that's going on there.
I have said many times publicly, and I'll say it again, in many, many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man, but the consequences of him being president of the United States are brutally serious.
It's sort of troubling that they feel threatened to the degree that they have to code their support for Harrison Waltz in the clothing of a Trump campaign poster, while at the same time feeling the sort of dire necessity of broadcasting that they support Harrison Waltz.
Oh, you guys are at the wrong rally.
There is a subtle sort of psychological rub that's going on with this typography. For the non-typographer, it is a series of details in the typography that add up to a message on top of the actual language. It's most akin to the clothing that we choose to wear and what kind of message that sends about us. Clothing is semiotic. It's a sign unto itself. And we all can read things like a three-piece suit. We know what a little black dress means and a pair of blue jeans and a t-shirt. We have expectations that come along with those pieces of clothing about who wears them and what the circumstances are and what they're projecting. It's similar with typefaces. There's an underlying skeleton there, but the clothing that you put on top of it sends this subtle signal to those who read it about the person or the organization that put together that message. It's a little more subtle than clothing, but it's like the difference between a handmade suit and an off-the-rack suit. There are subtle differences that all of us are picking up on, whether we're cognizant of it or not.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
And this week I had the pleasure to invite here to our studio the editor-in-chief of Brazil's biggest daily, Folha de São Paulo. His name is Sérgio Dávila. He was visiting London for work. It was a pleasure. It's the newspaper I've been reading since I was a child.
It was something that every poll we had with readers, they would mention, when are we going to have Guia back? And we took notice, and since the opportunity was there and the money made sense, we decided to bring it back to life. And to my personal joy, because I'm a part of being the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, I'm a user of the guide. So I was missing our guide. We just had the International São Paulo Movie Festival, and historically we were the newspaper that had a guide dedicated exclusively to this festival, and we did again, and it was great to see lines of people waiting to see the next movie, all of them with our guide in hands, consulting and reading. It was really a nice sensation to see that.
And Sergio, just because you're here, and I know you're going to rush back to Brazil because there's a massive political event happening next week, the U.S. presidential elections. How important is the elections for Folha? Because I know you've been working with Folha for many years. You were their correspondent in Washington as well, right? So I think this is actually very close to your heart.
Yeah, it's important for all the world, and of course Brazil is not excluded from that, and Folha is not excluded from this kind of story, because it will affect us if it's Kamala or if it's Trump. So we are covering very closely. We have a correspondent in Washington, Fernanda is there, and we have a senior columnist in New York, Lúcia Guimarães, and we sent one of our best reporters. She's an editor at large, Patrícia Campos Melo. She's one of the main names in the newsroom right now. So we are prepared to deal with this very heavy flow of information that we will have starting next Tuesday. If you ask me what's going to happen, I don't know.
Who's going to win?
Yeah, I'd love to know that, but it's going to be... I don't think we will know who's the winner on Tuesday. I think, remember, in 2020, we just knew the winner next Saturday. So I think that's going to be the case. I don't think Saturday, but I think it's going to take a while for us to know who won the elections.
I have actually a question kind of related to the U.S. elections. More recently, we've seen newspapers like the Washington Post saying that they're not going to endorse any of the candidates. Remind me, how is the situation in Brazil with Folha? Do you guys ever endorse a presidential candidate in the country? I was wondering, because I know Brazil is perhaps a little bit less in endorsing than in the U.S., but correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah,
we don't have this tradition in the Brazilian press to endorse political candidates, and certainly Folha never had this tradition, and I think it's a good thing for us, because you have to understand that the Brazilian reader are not as I don't want to say that, but it's very, very difficult for us to make clear what is opinion, what is reporting, what is newspaper's opinion, what is a columnist opinion. When you are on the internet, on a social network, everything seems like Folha's opinion. Even if we have breaking news on some candidate or other candidate, people always or most of the time assume, that's Folha's opinion on this guy or that guy. If we start to endorse political candidates, I think it will add to this confusion. So it's nothing that we want to do right now. And I have a theory about what led Washington Post to do that, but we are not planning to do the opposite. We are not planning to start endorsing political candidates right now. There was some elections where our competitors endorsed this or that candidate, but we never did. And I think it's best this way.
Interesting, because, and you're very right, it can create confusion. And I remember perhaps Folha for being, the biggest, very popular in Brazil. I remember when I lived there were accusations. The leftists were saying, oh, Folha is right-wing. And then the right-wing is saying, Folha is too much to the left. But I guess that's a good thing, if everybody's accusing of supporting the other candidates in a way.
We have nicknames from the left and the right to the name of the newspaper. The left called us Fail of São Paulo, Falha de São Paulo. And the right called us Foice de São Paulo, like the symbol of the Communist Party. So I think we are doing something right, because if both sides are disagreeing with us, I think we are doing journalism, which is what we are paid to do.
And now a highlight of the menu. This time we live through a new cookbook by Tim Anderson, dedicated to the cuisine of the Japanese island of Hokkaido.
I did want it to be something you could pick up and learn from. And I did write it. Kurt Vonnegut, I read this quote from him a while ago. He said you should write for an audience of one. And the sort of implication is that you should write for yourself. So I wrote the book that I wanted to read, basically, because I wanted to understand Hokkaido a bit more in depth and really get under the hood of the dishes and the foods in general there. And there's things that I wish I had covered, and there was a lot that got cut out. The manuscript was about 25% longer than it was. The thing about cookbooks is that the recipes are sort of the meat. That's what people buy them for. So there is a little bit of a conflict there in terms of what I want to say and what the book is supposed to be for, which is, of course, cooking. And I hope people do use it for that, because the dishes are delicious. But yeah, there's also, I should say, like a personal side to it. The question of why Hokkaido comes up even to me in my head. And so I wanted to kind of add my own personal experiences there. Not too much. I wanted to be about Hokkaido, but and it's a bigger question for me, actually. People always ask, why Japan? Why Japan generally? And that's a big question. And I usually can only give a short answer. So in this one, I'm able to go a little bit deeper and be a little bit more reflective on that side as well.
How does Hokkaido's cuisine fit within the other regional cuisines of Japan? There's a lot there. Historically, lots of stratification, colonialism, complications, but also the sheer kind of amazingness of the produce.
Yeah, I almost don't know where to start. I think that the first thing to say for people to understand about Hokkaido is that it wasn't part of Japan until really quite recently in Japanese history. It was annexed in 1869, 1 year after the Meiji Restoration. Before that, there was a Japanese presence in Hokkaido. There were clans that were controlling trade and had outposts there, but it was only officially part of Japan from then, which is partly why it's so different. So there's three sort of streams of food in Hokkaido. There is the indigenous food from the Ainu and a few other ethnic groups that were there before. And that is its own whole other thing, which is covered a little bit in the book. But we have some recipes contributed by Hiroaki Kon, who's a chef based in Sapporo. He's an Ainu chef who has a restaurant there and also hosts a lot of Ainu cooking and cultural events. So it's a real kind of honor to have his contributions there. And that food it's very different from what people might expect from Japanese food. The seasoning's very different. Traditionally, they don't use sort of Japanese koji-based seasonings like miso, mirin, or soy sauce, the things we expect from Japanese food. Their seasonings are based on salt, usually kombu, and oil or animal fat or fish fat. Traditionally, those are sort of the core seasonings in Ainu food. It's different now because obviously they've had a long history of dispossession and discrimination, and also a lot of the sort of crops and foods that were used in Ainu food pre-Meiji have been either eradicated or endangered, basically. So it's changed a lot. And of course, there's a lot of what you might call fusion, although that's a tricky term, but basically incorporating flavors and ingredients, not just from Japanese food, but actually from around the world. So, for example, Kon-san, his cooking background he is in Italian food. He trained in Italy, had a restaurant in Osaka, so he incorporates that into Ainu food and vice versa. So there's Ainu food, and again, a huge topic, and it's something that people, I hope, will do their own research on, because this is just one small glimpse of it. And then, of course, there is the food brought in by the Meiji government, and that was modeled on America, mainly, the US, but also Middle Europe. That's where you get the famous cheese and butter and lamb. And a lot of these things also, which is interesting, is that the foods themselves are actually byproducts of getting materials for the military. So pork turns up a lot in Hokkaido food. It wasn't really eaten, though, until they wound up with a surplus from making leather for army boots and jackets and things like that. Same goes for lamb. One of the most famous Japanese Hokkaido dishes is Genghis Khan, which is a barbecued lamb dish. They were raising them for wool, and then the government basically said, well, we've got all this lamb. Everybody should try to eat it as well. Because at that time, there was also a huge push to sort of get the country eating more meat, because there were nutritional deficiencies all over the country, especially in terms of protein. So they just thought it's a win-win, basically. And then there's the seafood and what you might call the Japanese washoku influence, which has been there in a small way since before Meiji, but obviously came in a big way after that. And you had Japanese settlers coming and the Japanese military. And all these things sort of weave together or don't. Like, they remain quite distinctive in a lot of ways. There is some Ainu influence in Japanese food in Hokkaido and vice versa. The kombu is a big one. Kombu, a lot of historians think, was basically introduced to Japanese food by the Ainu. So that's a massive sort of overlap there. And also just in terms of the ingredients that are used, the produce and the seafood and the wild animals as well. Venison is quite big in Hokkaido in both Ainu and Japanese cooking. So yeah, it stands apart, I think, quite distinctly from the rest of Japan.
And finally, here on The Curator, Monocle's editors and correspondents take you behind the scenes on the making of the magazine's fashion pages. As our November issue hits newsstands, our design correspondent Stella Roos tells us about reporting the issue's lead fashion story, a deep dive into Swiss heritage house Bali.
So Bali's studio or creative offices are in Milan, and Simone is Italian. And I think that's part of the reason why he has been able to so successfully mine this Swiss identity. And Bali really has heaps of that. So they still have their shoemaking factory in Lugano, and they have this 173-year-old history. And Simone, I went there and he had this mood board where there were like 1960s teddy boys in Zurich, these like leather guys, and then also fall costumes from the Appenzeller region of people dressed as trees. And he has been able to translate this into clothing that on first glance, it's really something that you could see them on a banker in Geneva and not bat an eye. But then when you look closer, he has all these kind of humorous details. His signature bag takes the form of a cowbell, and he has these studs of like Edelweiss and cows, and it's almost like a personality that he has really, this Swiss style that he has really been able to translate into clothing.
Exactly, and it's that right balance between humor and a few eccentric touches, but still classic clothes that even bankers in Geneva can wear. Do you think that that's important when in fashion, in a design house, because you cover both sectors, that when a new designer comes in, they do respect the heritage and don't try to completely wipe out the history, do something really modern? Because when they did try to do that, I think with Ruigi, Simone's predecessor, there's a lot more celebrity-driven, a lot more trend-driven. It didn't quite work, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Simone first came in to be the right-hand man of Ruigi, and there was this ambition to turn Bali into this sort of streetwear brand, which in a fun detail also is part of Bali's history. It was really popular in the 80s in the US with its sneakers. But what really amazed me about Simone was, so he spent, I think, 14 years in the atelier of Gucci before coming to Bali. So he really is a stitches guy. Like, he really knows everything about the materials and about the cut and just about how you make a really good piece of clothing. And when I met him, when I came in for the interview, like often when you meet a creative director, you know, it's like a huge ego, it's all these abstract concepts. And Simone was really not interested in like holding forth at the interview, but we ended up spending hours in the showroom, and he was showing me the clothes and the details, and he was showing me videos of the factory workers in Lugano making the shoes. And he was just genuinely amazed at the craftsmanship that Bali has cultivated over 100 years.
And that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by Jack Dewars and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week, and thank you for listening.